The night Petra Sinclair walked out of her own anniversary dinner, she didn't slam a single door. That was the part nobody understood afterward. Her sister kept saying she would have thrown a wine glass. Her colleague at the firm said she would have made a scene. But Petra didn't do any of that. She picked up her clutch from the back of her chair, smoothed the front of her dress, the navy silk one she'd bought specifically for that evening, and walked out of the private dining room at Maison Laurent, as though she'd simply remembered somewhere else she needed to be. She had in fact remembered exactly where she needed to be, but that comes later. The dinner had been Garrett's idea. Garrett Sinclair always had ideas. That was one of the things Petra had loved about him. When they first met at a charity auction in Vancouver 14 years ago, he walked into a room and immediately began rearranging it in his mind, seeing what it could become, what she could become, what they could build together. He had the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who truly mattered to him, and at 31 Petra had found that thrilling. At 44 she understood it differently. The reservation at Maison Laurent had been made 6 weeks in advance. Garrett had told her it was for their anniversary. 13 years married, and he wanted to do something special. He'd been distant for months by then, coming home late with explanations that were just plausible enough that she hadn't pushed, working weekends that stretched into Sunday evenings, taking calls in the garage that he'd end abruptly when she opened the side door. She'd noticed all of it. She'd also noticed herself making excuses for him, the way you fold a piece of paper along an old crease, because it's easier than creating a new one. She told herself things were fine. She told herself this at the gym, in the shower, driving the 40 minutes to her office at Sinclair and Marsh Architecture, the firm she had co-founded 12 years ago, and quietly built into one of the most respected mid-sized firms in British Columbia. She told herself this while signing contracts, while reviewing structural load calculations, while presenting to clients who flew in from Calgary and Toronto specifically to work with her. She was very good at telling herself things. The night of the anniversary dinner, Petra arrived at Maison Laurent at 7:15. Garrett had said 7:30, but she liked being early. She liked having a moment to herself before anything began. The maitre led her to a private room in the back, a small, elegant space with dark wood paneling and a single long table set for 8. Petra stopped in the doorway. 8 place settings. She counted them twice. Garrett arrived at 7:25 and he was not alone. Behind him came his mother, Elaine Sinclair, in the ivory blazer she saved for occasions she considered significant. Behind Elaine came Garrett's younger brother Colin and Colin's wife Dana. And then at the end of the small procession, came a woman Petra had never seen before, tall, in her mid-30s, wearing a dress the color of a winter rose, laughing at something Colin had said as though she'd been laughing at his jokes for months. She had been. Petra would learn that later too. Garrett looked at Petra with an expression she would spend the drive home trying to name. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was something more complicated. The look of a man who has rehearsed a difficult scene and is now annoyed that the other actor has arrived early and disrupted the blocking. "You're here," he said. "I am," Petra said. Elaine kissed her on the cheek, the way she always had, with warmth that Petra had spent years believing was genuine. "Doesn't Maison Laurent do a beautiful job with their private rooms?" Elaine said, moving past her. Garrett introduced the woman as Simone Beaumont. He said she was a client. He said it the way people say things they've technically made true, by saying them out loud, as though the word client could cover everything else underneath it. Simone Beaumont smiled at Petra with the self-possession of someone who'd been told this evening might be awkward and had decided it wouldn't be for her at least. "I've heard so much about you," Simone Beaumont said. Petra looked at her for one long moment. "I haven't heard anything about you," she said pleasantly, and turned to find her seat. The dinner was a performance and everyone had a role. Elaine kept the conversation moving, asking about Colin's kids, complimenting the bread, laughing at the right moments. Dana, who had never been warm to Petra but had also never been openly cruel, said very little and stared at her water glass more than once. Colin told a long story about a fishing trip in Haida Gwaii that no one was particularly interested in. Simone Beaumont sat 2 seats down from Garrett and spoke when spoken to and occasionally glanced at him with an ease that told Petra exactly what she needed to know. Garrett ordered wine without asking her preference. That was new. Or maybe it wasn't new. Maybe she'd simply stopped noticing. Petra ate her appetizer. She answered questions about the firm. A hotel commission in Kelowna she'd just won. A community center in New Westminster that was breaking ground in the spring. He was composed. She was gracious. He was exactly the Petra Sinclair she'd been in every difficult room she'd ever sat in, and there had been many. But something had shifted in her, quietly and irrevocably, the moment she'd seen 8 place settings and understood what they meant. It wasn't anger exactly. Or it was anger, but underneath it was something older and sadder. The recognition that she'd known on some level for a long time, that the late nights and the garage phone calls and the particular way Garrett had stopped reaching for her hand in public, had all been telling her the same thing, and she had been very deliberately not listening. She listened now. She listened to the sound of Elaine asking Simone Beaumont if she skied, and Simone saying yes, she loved Whistler, and Elaine saying oh they had a place in Whistler, they'd have to go up together sometime. She listened to the casual way Elaine said we. The way Garrett's mother had already redrawn the map of the family to include this woman, and exclude the one currently sitting at her table eating Dover sole. She listened to Garrett say almost nothing to her directly for 45 minutes. She set down her fork after the main course was cleared. She picked up her clutch from the back of her chair. She stood, smoothed the front of her navy dress, and she said very calmly, I have an early site meeting, I'll leave you all to enjoy dessert. Garrett looked up. Something flickered across his face. Petra, have a lovely evening, she said. She didn't look at Simone Beaumont on her way out. She didn't look at Elaine. She walked through the dining room of Maison Laurent and out through the front door and stood on the sidewalk on Robson Street in the October air and breathed. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Garrett. She let it go to voicemail. She got in her car and she drove. Not home, not yet. She drove to the office. The offices of Sinclair and Marsh Architecture were on the 10th floor of a building in Yaletown, overlooking False Creek. Petra had chosen the space herself 11 years ago. Partly for the light and partly for the view. She believed that architecture was about relationships between a building and its surroundings, and she liked to do her best thinking somewhere she could see the water. She let herself in with her keycard, went to her desk and sat for a long time without turning on the lights. The firm had been hers before it was theirs. That was the precise legal and emotional reality. Sinclair and Marsh had been Petra's idea, built on her reputation, her client relationships, and the 2 years of unglamorous work she'd done before Garrett suggested that his name might open certain doors that hers, then Petra Walsh, might not. He hadn't been wrong. His family connections in Vancouver's development community had mattered early on. But they'd mattered for perhaps 3 years, and the firm had now been running profitably for 12. The doors Garrett's name opened had long since been overshadowed by the ones Petra's work kept open on its own. She sat in the dark office and looked at False Creek and understood something she perhaps should have understood years earlier. She had been supporting him far longer than he had supported her. Not financially. She had always earned more, had always been the one whose contracts anchored the firm's growth, but in the other ways that matter. She had attended his family's functions and spoken warmly of his mother, and made space for his moods and managed around his absences. She had been the one doing the quiet work of keeping things intact. The marriage, the firm, the version of Garrett Sinclair that the world was allowed to see. She pulled her laptop toward her and began working. What happened over the following 3 weeks, Petra would later describe as simply catching up with myself. She met with a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone who moved in their circles, but a sharp woman in Burnaby named Helena Shore, who specialized in corporate and matrimonial law, and who it turned out, had worked with complicated cases involving shared business entities before. Petra laid out the structure of Sinclair and Marsh clearly and carefully. Helena Shore listened, asked precise questions, and told Petra that her position was considerably stronger than she might think. Petra had built the firm. Petra had maintained its key client accounts. Petra's name was on 11 of the 13 major contracts currently active, and this was the part she'd never fully reckoned with until Helena Shore pointed it out. Garrett's participation in the operational decisions of the firm had been minimal for the better part of 4 years. He attended client dinners. He signed his name where asked. He played a role. The role, it turned out, was largely decorative. She also called her accountant, a meticulous man named Patrick, who had been managing the firm's books since year 3, and had a conversation about the structure of certain assets that she should have had 2 years ago. She said nothing to Garrett. She came home at normal hours, made coffee in the morning, answered his texts with ordinary replies. He seemed relieved by her silence about the dinner, as though he'd been braced for a fight and was grateful not to have one. He took her compliance for surrender. Petra noticed this too, and filed it away. She'd been told all her life that she was too quiet, that she didn't push back enough, that her stillness was passivity. She'd spent years knowing it wasn't, and never quite finding the way to explain the difference to people who confused noise with strength. Garrett had always been one of those people. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Garrett came home at 6, which was early for him. He poured himself a whiskey and sat at the kitchen island and told her, with the careful tone of a man who has practiced, that he thought they should talk about where they were. Petra sat across from him and folded her hands on the counter and waited. He talked for nearly 20 minutes. He said things like grown apart and different stages and I care about you deeply. He said Simone Beaumont was someone who made him feel like himself again, which Petra had heard people say situations like this and had never understood, because she always wanted to ask, which self, exactly? The one before the work, before the money, before everything you wanted arrived and turned out to feel somehow insufficient? She didn't ask, she let him talk. When he finished he said, I think we both know this hasn't been working for a while. Petra looked at him, this man she'd sat across from for 14 years, whose coffee order she knew by heart, whose mother's birthday she'd never once forgotten, whose career she'd helped shape so quietly that he'd apparently forgotten her fingerprints were on every part of it. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay. I'll have the papers drawn up." He stared at her. He'd expected she knew something else. Tears maybe. Argument. The particular performance of devastation that would let him feel simultaneously guilty and validated. She'd seen it in his posture when he sat down. The set of a man ready to absorb. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. She stood up, took her coffee cup to the sink, rinsed it, placed it in the rack. She went to bed at 10:30 and slept better than she had in months. The papers, when drawn up by Helena Shore, were thorough. They were thorough in ways that Garrett and his family lawyer, a man named Brooks who wore suits that cost more than most people's rent and specialized in friendly, well-networked settlements, were not immediately prepared for. The question of the firm's asset division was complex. It required careful examination of founding documents, capital contributions, client contract ownership, and the operational records of the past 12 years. Helena Shore had already requested all of it. Garrett's lawyer made several suggestions that Helena Shore declined, politely and completely. Garrett made a phone call to Petra directly, which she let go to voicemail, and then texted her saying he felt they didn't need this to be adversarial. She replied that she agreed, which was why she had an excellent lawyer ensuring it was handled properly. She did not reply to his next 3 messages. Elaine called twice. The first time Petra didn't pick up. The second time, she did, and listened to Garrett's mother, explain that she hoped Petra wasn't going to be difficult about this. That these things happen in marriages, that Garrett had always cared for her, and that the firm was as much his as hers given what the family name had meant for it in the early years. "Elaine," Petra said when there was a pause. "Yes? I'll have my lawyer's office send you our documentation on the firm's founding capital and client acquisition records. If you'd like to look at those before we continue this conversation, that might be useful for everyone." There was a silence. Elaine said she'd always thought Petra was a sensible woman. Petra said she had always been sensible. Yes, they ended the call on terms that were civil and exactly as cold as Petra intended. She moved into a rental condo in Kitsilano in December, a clean, light-filled place on the 3rd floor with a view of the mountains, and enough room for her books and her drafting table and a kitchen, where she made breakfast for herself every morning, and ate it without anyone's mood to manage. She put the firm's name change paperwork in motion in January. She'd discussed it with her business partner, Faye Marsh, who had been with her since year 2 and who said when Petra explained what had happened only, "It's overdue." The firm became Walsh & Marsh Architecture in March. She sent a brief announcement to their client list. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several clients mentioned in passing that they'd always thought of it as her firm anyway. The Kelowna Hotel Commission moved forward without interruption. The new Westminster Community Centre broke ground on schedule. 2 new commissions came in from a referral in Calgary. Petra hired a junior architect who reminded her of herself at 27. Hungry, precise, asking the right questions. She heard through mutual acquaintances, the way you do, about what was happening in Garrett's world. Without his position at Walsh & Marsh, the settlement had been clear that his role in the firm ended with the marriage. He had lost what he didn't quite realize he'd been using: access to her client relationships, her reputation, her network. He had his family connections, and those still counted for something. But the easy professional footing he'd had for 12 years was gone. He had to rebuild from somewhere. It turned out that was harder than he'd expected. Simone Beaumont, according to someone who knew someone, had moved in with him in February. She was in commercial real estate. That was something. Petra genuinely wished them no particular harm. What she noticed quietly was that she no longer needed to wish them anything at all. She had stepped out of the story they were in and into a different one entirely. Colin called her once in the spring. He seemed surprised that she picked up. He stumbled through an apology that was imprecise but genuine enough, and said he thought they could have handled everything differently. And she said she appreciated him saying so. They didn't become close. But it was something. The thing about walking out of that anniversary dinner at Maison Laurent. The thing that people always seemed to miss when Petra eventually told the story, which was rarely and only to people she trusted, was that it hadn't been an impulsive decision. It had felt like one, and that was the part people latched onto. The composure, the smooth front of the navy dress the clutch picked up so calmly. They heard that and thought, spontaneous dignity. But Petra had been making that decision for a long time. She'd been making it in every small moment she'd noticed something and said nothing. Every time she'd folded herself into a smaller shape to fit into the space a marriage had left her. The dinner hadn't been a beginning. It had been an ending she'd finally allowed herself to see. Her therapist, a thoughtful woman in Mount Pleasant she'd started seeing in February, said something once that stayed with her. That the people who seem calmest in crisis are usually the ones who have already done the grief work. In the small hours alone, before the crisis ever announced itself officially. Petra thought about the drive home from Maison Laurent, the October air when she'd stepped outside, False creak through the dark office window. The spreadsheets she'd gone over in those weeks before the conversation at the kitchen island. The quiet and methodical work of understanding exactly what she'd built and what it was worth. She hadn't been calm because she was cold. She'd been calm because she'd already said goodbye in the way that actually counts. Not loudly, not all at once, but piece by piece, in private, until there was nothing left to lose. The following October, Walsh and Marsh won a provincial design award for the new Westminster Community Centre. Petra accepted it at a ceremony in Vancouver with Faye beside her. And afterward they had dinner at a small Italian place on Commercial Drive that stayed open late and made a pasta. Petra had been ordering there since she was 32. She took the long way home through Kitsilano. The leaves on the trees along Point Grey Road were doing what they do every autumn. Going out in colors so unreasonable they seem almost boastful. The way the West Coast always seems slightly overdressed and entirely justified about it. The mountains were dark outlines across the water. She parked and sat for a moment before going inside. She wasn't happy the way people mean when they say it easily, as though it's a switch that gets flipped. She was something more specific, clear. She knew what her mornings looked like and who she was in them. She knew the weight of the work she was doing and why it mattered. She knew which people in her life had chosen to be there and which ones had been filling space. That was more than enough. That, in fact, was almost everything. She picked up the award from the passenger seat, a piece of etched glass that caught the light in a particular way she liked, and carried it inside.